Okay, let's take a few minutes and talk about software planning because after decades of building software, no company really has it figured out. It still eludes most shops on how to go about the process of designing and building software to meet business needs. So in the early decades of software development, we did a thing called Waterfall based on building houses and other things that we had a set process for, which it works for in some cases, it doesn't in others, but it was essentially Waterfall what most shops did, which is to say you start off by scoping all the requirements for what a system is to contain. We would spend weeks, months scoping, and at the end of it, have a big scope document of all of the high level requirements that would get signed off on, and then we would begin design. We would, it could take months depending on how big of a system we were building, but you would create a document essentially that would contain every screenshot, every button click, every process down to the nth detail of what this system was going to look and act like once it was developed, all represented on paper in hundreds of pages, sometimes thousands of pages of a big specification document. Once it was obsessed over for all this time and finally signed off on, it would then and only then be coded. And it would be coded to spec, as we used to call it, which was great for developers because in the old days, developers could just be the introverts that most want to be in their cubicle or in their basement and just code the specification in front of them. And once those months went by and all of the code had been written, coded to spec, it was then code complete, signed off, and sent over the wall now to the testing department, which would then test everything in it, create bugs, which the developers would then go back and fix. And then once it was test complete, then and only then would it then be delivered. So this waterfall methodology, pretty straightforward, a lot of planning, a lot of upfront work. What could possibly go wrong? I think this slide speaks for itself. And another example, did you know that the movie Back to the Future originally cast Eric Stoltz? And it wasn't until well into filming that they realized he just wasn't right for the part and fired him for Michael J. Fox. So the point being, things change, right? So it's really hard when you do so much upfront planning and then you try to execute a plan that takes months and years when things change so much in the business world. And the other thing is you don't always know all of the requirements that you're going to need down the road. Business needs evolve, changes happen, software evolves. So when you're in a very rigid waterfall approach, it's not very adaptable to changing business needs. And it requires a tremendous amount of upfront work to do all of that planning, all of that design well before anything is developed, which of course drives the need for a large change control process to handle things for when you're in the middle of the coding phase and a business requirement changes and now you have to go through and change the design and halt the coding on one thing and change it to another. You now have more processes to go through to handle that. So around the turn of the century, the thought leaders in software process created what is essentially the new way of doing things called Agile, not a specific technology or tool set, just an approach, a different process, a different methodology based on these tenets that individuals and interactions are more important than processes and tools, that working software is more important than comprehensive documentation, that customer collaboration is more important over contract negotiations, and that responding to change is more important than following a plan. So what does this new agile process look like? Well, if I showed you this slide, you'd say, well, that's just waterfall. What's really different? And there are several things, but really this stays intact, believe it or not. It's just different in that you do this process per each unit of functionality, per user story or individual piece of discrete functionality. So you do the process, and then you do the process, and you do the process. And even if you need to wait until 237 of 315 user stories are completed before something is delivered to production environment, that's still fine. But by doing this, by breaking it down into smaller pieces of deliverable functionality, you are so much more adaptable and flexible to changing business needs. And of course, Agile isn't perfect either, but when you don't know all of the requirements up front very well, it's a much leaner, more adaptable process to follow that requires far less upfront work and definition and allows you to respond to change a lot better. But even with that, there are still negatives to Agile, of course. In fact, there was recently a presentation where one of those thought leaders had this quote talking about how we had Waterfall and we didn't like it, so we created Agile, and now we don't like that, and maybe it's us, which is to say that there is no silver bullet solution to process and methodology for delivering software, and every group is supposed to do what works best ultimately for your team and your company. But with Agile, we can be more adaptable and leaner as we deliver software, which is why we use it in so many cases.